Hi there. So let me tell you a little bit about how this idea came about. About 4 years ago, some high school friends of mine and I got together and we watched the original Star Wars trilogy. We sat and watched all 3 movies through because that's what I do when I'm with my geeky high school friends. And not too long after that, I read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I don't know if any of you have read that, but it was one of the first mashup books that became really popular, where they took Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and they added zombies into the plot line. And then just after I finished that book, I went to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival with my family and saw some plays there. And so I kind of had Star Wars and Shakespeare and mashups all bouncing around in my head. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to rewrite Star Wars as though it were a play by Shakespeare? And so I looked up Quirk Books online. They're in Philadelphia, and I knew that they had published Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and some other mashups. And so I looked them up, and their editor's email address was there on their website. And so I sent him an email, and I said, look, I've got this idea. What do you think about it? And he wrote me back and said, it's an interesting idea, and if you actually write something, let me know, and I'll take a look at it. So I sat down to write the first act of the first book. So that's, if you know your Shakespeare, that's the first fifth of the play, right? And so I sat down and wrote that and sent it back to him, and he called me that morning and said, I really like this, and I want to publish it, and the next step is to get Lucasfilm on board and get Lucasfilm's licensing. And so he sent what I had written off to them, and I had stayed very close to the original movie, because you think of Lucasfilm as being pretty protective of their stuff, right? And so I had stayed well within the bounds of the movie, hadn't added a lot of my own stuff. I'd put it in iambic pentameter and use Shakespearean words, but not done a lot besides that. They wrote back and they said, well, we like where this is going so far, but we want to see if he can do more with it. We want to see if he can go outside the bounds of the movie a bit and really make it his own. So I went back and revised the first couple of scenes. And if you know the original Star Wars movie, in the first scenes you have C-3PO and R2-D2 on the Rebel ship. And so I went back and thought, wouldn't it be fun if, up to that point I had R2-D2 saying things like, beep, meep, beep, wee, whistle, whistle, woo, things like that. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun if, when he's alone on stage, he could turn to the audience and speak in a soliloquy in English, and basically reveal that he can speak English the whole time, but he's actually speaking in beeps and squeaks to other characters as a way of sort of hiding what he can do. So I did that and made some other changes. We sent it back to Lucasfilm, and they said, okay, we're ready to talk about licensing, and 3.5 years later, here we are. So that's how the books came to be.
Okay, yeah, I'll be asking him some questions, but also you guys think of your own questions that you want to ask, and you'll definitely have time for that. So if you have a question, just hold on to it for a few minutes. Probably after we do the scene, I'll ask you guys if you have questions, and we'll do it that way. So you were talking about working with Lucasfilm, and now, of course, it's owned by Disney, which they purchased for $4.1 or $2 billion, I believe. So now that Disney's involved, has that changed things? Is there a possibility? And actually, why don't we talk about, you wrote it as a play. Has it been a play? Will it be a play?
Sure. So Disney purchased Lucasfilm like 3 or 4 months after I had the idea and was talking to Quirk Books, and we were talking to Lucasfilm. Then the announcement came out that Disney was buying Lucasfilm, and both me and my editor were nervous about, what does this mean? Does it mean that we're not going to be able to do this book at all? And it turned out to actually be fine. I mean, for whatever reason, they sort of left our little project alone and let it go through, and so that was all great. In terms of the plays, so the way it works when you write a Star Wars book is that the copyright for the book goes in Lucasfilm's name, not the author's name, which is unusual. Most times, like J.K. Rowling will have all of her books copyrighted in her name, so that she can make decisions about what to do with the book. Lucasfilm has the copyright for these books, so they get to decide what happens to them. They could mount a Broadway production, they could make a movie, they could do whatever and not ask me about it, which is fine. And so Lucasfilm, up to this point, has basically said nobody can do public performances or readings in any sort of formal way. If we're doing a book event, then okay, sure, but otherwise they really can't do that. I'm hopeful that since Disney now owns Lucasfilm, Lucasfilm has never had to worry about anybody wanting to stage Star Wars, whereas Disney is used to is used to Broadway productions of their musicals and high schools doing their musicals and things like that. So they have a whole theater department. So I'm hopeful that maybe that means that at some point these will be performed on stage at some point. Although I will say that especially when I wrote the first one, I was only thinking of it as a book. I was not thinking of it as a play.
But we're allowed to do a scene, right?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
there you go. Why don't we go ahead and do our scene? So let's have Ian, if you want to step to the side, and if the movie is queued up. Yep, perfect. All right, we'll do that right out.
Which way? All right, men, load your weapon. Stop that ship! Blast them!
I'd forgotten how much I hate space travel.
It's like an Imperial cruiser. Our passengers must be hotter than I thought. Try and hold them off. Angle of the deflector shield while I make the calculations for the jump to light speed.
Stay sharp. There's two more coming in. They're going to try and cut us off.
Why didn't you outrun them? I thought you said this thing was fast.
Watch your mouth, kid. You're going to find yourself floating home.
We'll be safe enough once we make the jump to hyperspace. Besides, I know a few maneuvers will lose them. Here's where the fun begins. How long before you can make the jump to light speed?
Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the navigator computer.
Kidding at the rate they're gaining?
Traveling through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and then it into your circle real quick, wouldn't it?
What's that flashing?
We're losing a deflector shield.
Don't strap yourselves in. I'm going to make the jump to light speed.
All right, thank you. Okay, so that's the scene. And of course, Mr. Doescher had to figure out a way to translate that to a Shakespearean kind of stage, which is pretty impossible, but he did a good job with it. Now we're going to see his version of it. And so we have probably your dream cast for a Star Wars movie coming out here. Please put your hands together and welcome Mr. Ryan Ebling as Han Solo. Mrs. Ann Singleton as Luke Skywalker. Ms. Tarzinski as Obi-Wan Kenobi. And Diane Nasland as Chewbacca. Here, let's move this mic.
Mos Eisley now is left behind at last, while newer scenes come into view apace. As Han's Millennium Falcon flies far fast, the action of our play moves back to space.
Nay, wherefore canst thou now outrun them both? For thou didst boast of the strange vessel's speed.
Pray mark thy words, lad, else thou surely wilt become like refuge to the Star Destroyer and float away vanishing as the stars. Or more, we shall soon safely fly, once we keep the jump to hyperspace in the air. And what is more, my skill not all exceed at making game universe. All my life have I escaped one
Nerf was on the speed of light. Through rocky field and harsh terrain we went. Within, around, and backward was our game. I caught the Nerf test during the day that I seemed like I got you.
How long now ere thou canst achieve light speed?
2 more moments. Shall I take while this computer's off its navigation work?
But art thou mad? For certain they approach. I have not made this journey just to die. This man shall surely be the end of me.
Travel into hyperspace is not the same as designing a dusting of the crop upon that land of infinite dry sand. Sand calculations quite exact. We would like run through a belt of asteroids or hit upon a planet's center mark. Should such our fate come, my trip would end before it had begun.
But oh, what now? What light through yonder flashing sensor breaks?
I march leaves and lost beyond the deflector shield. I bid thee peace. Now sit and God take heed. We're all prepared to jump under light.
Han graspeth quick the console in his hand. Then suddenly the ship is bathed in light. With roar of engine, noise profound and grand, the great Millennium Falcon takes her flight. And scene.
All right, well, Mr. Doescher, why don't you tell us specifically about how you adapted that particular scene, some of the things that you were thinking about, and then after that I'm going to take questions from the audience. I've got a bunch of questions I can ask this guy, but I want to see what you guys want to ask him. But let's talk about this particular scene first.
Sure. So a few things that you may have noticed. I mean, at its basic level, of course, that's all an iambic pentameter. There are some words we think of as Shakespearean in there. But then there's things like, in the movie, Han says, I know a few maneuvers myself. And in my version, he actually goes off on this little tangent about when he was young and chased after this Nerf, and he remembers chasing it on his speeder bike all over the place, which is a very Shakespearean thing to do, right? In the middle of a line to sort of recall this earlier time. And it makes reference to in The Empire Strikes Back when Leia calls him a Nerf herder, which is supposed to be an insult, but now we see in fact that he did, in fact, herd Nerfs at one point. There was one that got a chuckle, or maybe a snicker is the appropriate word, from the front. What light through yonder flashing sensor breaks, right? That I threw in a few Shakespearean references throughout the books, just basically when I thought it would be fun to do. I do have one moment where Luke Skywalker, changing out of his stormtrooper outfit in the first movie, holds up the stormtrooper helmet and says, "Alas, poor stormtrooper." That sort of thing. So instead of what light through yonder flashing sensor breaks is straight out of Romeo and Juliet, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun, right? So there's that. There's also, since this is in iambic pentameter, there are just certain words that don't work in, or phrases that don't work in iambic pentameter. And one of them is Millennium Falcon, right? And it's because it has two unstressed syllables right next to each other, which you can't do in iambic pentameter. So I have to, every time I write Millennium Falcon, I basically shorten the last two syllables at the end. So it sort of becomes Millennium Falcon, right? It sort of becomes this little abbreviation. Again, something Shakespeare did all the time to get his words to fit into the meter. And then there's the use of the chorus character. The chorus comes to us, as you all know, from your English classes, right, from early Greek drama. But Shakespeare used it in Henry V when he was trying to, Henry V tells the story of these mighty battles of the English against the French at Agincourt and Harfleur. And Shakespeare, to deal with that, has the chorus come out and basically apologize that on this stage they can't, actually show these huge battles. And I realized as soon as I started writing the book that I had a similar challenge, right? How do you deal with all these action sequences that are in the movies, where there's just people running around doing things, when in Shakespeare it's all driven by language. And so the chorus was kind of my answer to that. Yeah.
All right, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Someone just raise your hand and call out your question.
Yeah. Go for it. Yeah, so it's nearly 100% sure that yes, I'm going to be writing a book for Star Wars 7. Will probably come out not this fall, but fall of 2017, because Lucasfilm wants to release it sort of in the run-up to Episode 8. I don't normally base them off a particular play, so it'll be more a question of sort of which elements am I pulling in, and you know, which characters are like what other characters maybe in Shakespeare and that kind of thing. So yeah, but I do hope that that'll be happening in 2017. Yeah.
The question was, would he do anything based off the expanded universe, not just the films themselves, but beyond that? Yeah.
I sometimes I've gotten a couple of requests, not from Lucasfilm but from Star Wars fans, to do like the Clone Wars or something like that. I have not thought about taking any of the books and turning them into a Shakespearean play. Part of that is that I think one of the reasons these books work is that, you know, the original product was a movie, not a book. It seems a little funny to me to take. I've had requests to do William Shakespeare's Lord of the Rings, and to me that seems kind of funny because, you know, why would you read my stuff when you could just read Tolkien, you know, and who's infinitely better than me. So I haven't thought about taking any of the Star Wars books that are out there and doing this with them. I mean, if they ask me to, sure, but yeah.
All right, I'll ask, if you guys keep thinking, we'll come back, and if you want to ask some questions at the end, that's cool. So let's talk a little bit about the process of turning the movies into the Shakespearean language and whatever else. So were you thinking of particular Shakespeare plays or perhaps characters that you were sort of matching up to Star Wars scenes or characters? Anything like that?
I mean, only to a certain extent. So in the first book especially, Luke Skywalker, he's much more of a hero than I remember him being, right? I just remember him being sort of this whiny kid, right? Like, I was going to go to Tashi Station and pick up some power converters, right? But when you spend more time with the movie, you realize that he is absolutely the hero of that first book. And so he, you know, he gets sort of the Henry V treatment, where there's a moment when all the rebels are scared about going and fighting the Death Star, and which is very similar to in Henry V when all the English soldiers are scared because they are totally outnumbered by the French. And so Henry V gives this really rousing speech. And so I have Luke Skywalker basically do the same thing. And so he gives this speech and, you know, gets all the rebels excited to go and fight the Death Star. Obi-Wan Kenobi is always sort of my like fun. You know, he of many other characters, like he and Darth Vader are probably the most Shakespearean of anybody in Star Wars. And so writing their parts was really fun. I have Obi-Wan give a long speech right before he lets himself be killed about sort of the example that he's setting for future Jedi and things like that. Romeo and Juliet, when they are speaking to each other in Shakespeare's play, speak in rhyming quatrains, which are sets of 4 lines where the first and third line rhyme and the second and fourth line rhyme. And so I thought it'd be fun once Han and Leia start getting romantic with each other in The Empire Strikes Back to have them start speaking in rhyming quatrains to each other. And so they do that. And so that takes more time to write, but it was the sort of thing where, you know, I wanted there to continually be more and more surprises as the books went on. And so I started doing other fun things with characters, right? Admiral Akbar, whose famous line is, "It's a trap!" Right? So all of his lines end in some word that rhymes with "ap," which, you know, I didn't have to do, right? But just did because I thought it'd be fun. Mace Windu, played by Samuel L. Jackson, every single one of his lines contains the title of a Samuel L. Jackson movie. So like Pulp Fiction's thrown in there, Do the Right Thing, you know, everyone I could think of. And I was really scraping the bottom of the barrel by the time Mace Windu finally died. So it was things like that, things where, you know, some of it was inspired by Shakespeare and some of it was just inspired by what's a fun thing that I could do with a character.
I guess kind of another tie-in question with the Shakespeare. So you mentioned that Darth Vader was perhaps one of the most Shakespearean characters. Why do you see that, or how do you see the themes related to him tying in with Shakespeare?
Yeah, so I think if you take the first 6 movies as a whole, I think those could be called the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, right? In a very classical sense of the word tragedy, right? You've, I'm sure, all studied tragedy in your English classes, and there are all these sort of things that have to be fulfilled for it to be a tragedy. Well, like, his life story is the perfect tragedy. He has this tragic fall. He has this moment at the end where he realizes everything that's happened and sort of has this moment of redemption, right? So he is hands down the single most Shakespearean character of any of them. He reminds me a lot of somebody like King Lear, who sort of has this fall and ends up leading this really unfortunate life, and then at the end, only at the end, sort of realizes that he's, you know, what he's done and what he's been, and makes amends before he dies. So yeah, so that's my Darth Vader as tragic hero spiel.
All right. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier today, not in this class break, so I'll ask you about it here. You mentioned that it was kind of challenging to write Yoda because his normal vernacular in the films is to switch words around, which is something that Shakespeare did a lot. So how did you tackle making Yoda special still?
Yeah. So when the first book came out, which doesn't have Yoda in it, everyone kind of joked, like, oh, now everybody sounds like Yoda. Because when you're writing in iambic pentameter, to get the syllable pattern right, you sometimes have to change the word order around and get creative, right? And so people sounded, you know, a little like Yoda. So when it came to write the second book, The Empire Striketh Back, I knew that I had to do something fun with Yoda. And I had a few different ideas. One of my ideas was, okay, if everybody is, you know, going backward and speaking in Elizabethan English, maybe Yoda needs to go even farther back and speak in something like Chaucer's English. And so I tried writing some of that, and it turned out really badly. I realized that I do not have a gift for writing Chaucer's English. So I thought, okay, let's reverse it then. If everybody else is speaking back in Elizabethan English, let's have Yoda speak in modern English. So instead of saying, do or do not, there is no try, he'd say, oh, come on, just do it. You're being ridiculous. But that also didn't feel quite right. And so one day I was on a morning jog, which was when all my best ideas happened. And I had the idea, which ended up being the idea that worked, and I, you know, after I had the idea, sent it off to Quirk Books and Lucasfilm, and they all agreed that it worked. And so what it is that Yoda speaks in haiku, which is totally not Shakespearean at all. We have no evidence that Shakespeare knew anything about this ancient Japanese poetical form, and yet it is totally in keeping with the spirit of my project, right? Where it's this fun, you know, take on Shakespeare. So of course somebody who speaks in, you know, a different way is going to do something totally different. So I'll give you an example. This is Yoda teaching Luke, speaking in a series of haiku.
Nay, size matters not. Look thou at me, I prithee. Judge me by my size, and where you should not. For my ally, 'tis the force, a powerful ally. Life doth create it. Its energy surrounds us, binds us together.
So that's how Yoda sounds. Thanks.
What were some other things you did sort of to challenge yourself as a writer? I mean, to me, the whole thing sounds challenging because I cannot write iambic pentameter at all. I don't even really make my students do it because I couldn't tell if they were doing it right anyway. I just can't hear the beat. But you seem like you challenged yourself in several different ways and got really creative. So, want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So as the books went on, first of all, I didn't want somebody who had picked up the first book and read it to pick up subsequent books and be like, okay, this is just more of the same. I always wanted there to be surprises. And so there were things that were very clear and things that also were hidden. I hid, you know, what we all commonly call in like video games and things like that, Easter eggs throughout the books, right? For example, if you know what an acrostic is, that's a poem where the first letter of each line spells something going down, right? And so I wrote in Attack of the Clones, Anakin has a soliloquy, and it's a Rickroll, right? So down the left-hand side, it spells, never gonna give you up. But then it's actually a double acrostic because the last letter of each line spells, you've been Rickrolled. So that was one of these funny things, right? Or the fun things where I was like, I wonder if I could actually do a double acrostic and make it work. You know, I didn't know beforehand if I could make it work, but in fact, it ends up working fine. So there was something like that. There was another scene from Clones was when Obi-Wan goes and visits the cloners on Camino, the guys who actually make the clones. They're only in that movie for one scene, and it's, but they're very memorable characters. They look memorable and everything. So I wanted to do something sort of extra special for them. So I figured that since they were cloners, each of their lines would be cloned. So the very first line that one of them speaks is the exact same words as the very last line that they speak. And so the second line is the next to last line. And then it meets in the middle in this longer speech. And doing that and still trying to make it make sense, right? So that when they say something up at the top of the scene and Obi-Wan responds to it, and then when they repeat that line later on, it has a different meaning because now they're talking about something different, even though it's the same word. So that was a particular challenge, one that I was happy to do. Things like the Samuel L. Jackson titles. I mean, those were again challenges where it's like I decided this will be a fun thing to do, but whether or not I could actually do it, I wasn't sure. One of the things I've thought about in thinking about Star Wars 7, right, is each one of Poe Dameron's lines should reference an Edgar Allan Poe poem, right? Let's have Poe do Poe, right? So who knows? Who knows if that'll work or not? I don't know yet. So it's these challenges that hopefully certainly keep the writing experience fresh for me, and hopefully keep the reading experience fresh as well. And certainly with the Easter eggs, it's the kind of thing that sends people back into the books to look for things that they didn't see the first time. I'll give you one more example of that briefly here. One more example of an Easter egg. So if you Qui-Gon Jinn, of course, is played by Liam Neeson. And so when he and Obi-Wan are about to face off with Darth Maul, let me make sure I've got the whole thing here. Okay, when he and Obi-Wan are about to face off with Darth Maul, this is what Qui-Gon says. I know not who you are or who you want, yet I do have skills most particular acquired throughout a Jedi's long career. These skills do make me nightmarish to such as you. Surrender now, and you shall live. If not, you shall be dead, and there's an end. I'm hearing from some of so this is the kind of thing that only some people are going to get if they actually get it. That is basically, it's Shakespearean, and iambic pentamerized and all that kind of thing, but it's basically Liam Neeson's speech word for word from the movie Taken, with what he says on the phone to the guy who's taken his daughter. It was one of those things where I was like, that Liam Neeson line is too good not to put it also in Qui-Gon Jinn's mouth. So just dumb stuff like that I thought would be fun.
All right, let's turn to the audience again if anybody has a question. Otherwise, I've still got plenty. But we'd love to have you guys. All right, in the center there, yes.
Oh, yeah. So my favorite Star Wars movie is probably Return of the Jedi. The most common answer among Star Wars fans I've learned is Empire. I love Return of the Jedi because it was the first one I saw in the theater. I was 6 years old when it came out, and I always loved the Jabba the Hutt sequence. Had a fun time with that, and so just really enjoyed it. Yes, all the way in the back. My opinion on Jar Jar Binks. Okay, so if you're going to write the prequels, you have to deal with Jar Jar Binks, right? And so I wanted to, in some ways, because I wanted to make him a palatable character, right? I wanted to make him somebody that, even if you hated him in the movies, you wouldn't necessarily dislike him in mine. So I actually did something very similar to what I did with R2-D2, which is that when Jar Jar Binks is speaking to other characters, he's one way, but when he speaks to the audience, he's a totally different way. And so when he speaks to other characters, he's just like he is in the movie. He's dumb, and in fact, one of the little things I threw in, or ways I challenged myself, was all of his lines are one syllable short of actual iambic pentameter, which was my way of making him like one sandwich short of a picnic, right? But when he talks to the audience, you realize he's actually brilliant. And he's actually orchestrating events the way that he wants them to go, because he sees the Jedi coming to his planet as the opportunity to unite these two races of people who have been at war with each other, the Naboo and the Gungans, right? So when he first talks to the audience, it's actually in, perfectly good speech, and he's talking about his plan to do this because he sees Qui-Gon running toward him. But he says at the end of the speech, that, well, here, I've got it right here. This is what he says. Perchance this Jedi, followed by these droids, doth bring the word to break our deep mistrust. I shall make introduction in my way, portray the part that I have learned so well. It doth befit the human prejudice to think we Gungans simple, low, and rude. I shall approach him thus, yet shall bend him to the path that shall assist us all. Put on thy simple wits now, Jar Jar Binks, thus play the role of clown to stoke his pride. And then Qui-Gon Jinn enters, and all of a sudden Jar Jar's talking like a buffoon. So anyway, that's what I did.
One right down here.
Yes. I mean, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be Han Solo, right? My personality is way more C-3PO than that. But I always loved Han Solo. I mean, now that we've got a new movie, I love Rey. I think she's absolutely fantastic. I'm happy there's finally a really strong female character out there. So,
any others from the audience? Oh, there's one.
Do I think Shakespeare would be proud of me? I'm not sure proud's the word I'd use. I hope he'd be mildly amused. I hope he'd be honored, right, that somebody's doing this. I think if Shakespeare were alive today, I think he'd be writing things like Star Wars. He wrote what was the popular entertainment of his time, and so I think he'd be doing the same thing if he were alive today. If he saw what I wrote, I think he'd say, well, you're no Shakespeare, right? But hopefully, like I said, hopefully he'd be honored, and if nothing else, maybe amused. Yeah. And if nothing else, maybe he wouldn't sue. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that theory out there. I don't spend a lot of time on Star Wars fan boards, and in fact, as much as possible, I try to. Well, let me give you an example. A school teacher wrote to me. I think they were in Iowa, and she had been using the book with her class. And they had all, because what I do, at the beginning of every Star Wars movie, you've got the yellow words that go scrolling up the screen. And I turn that in each of my books into a Shakespearean sonnet. And so they, as a class, had done that for Star Wars 7 after spending some time with my books and doing their Shakespeare unit. And she sent me some of the best Star Wars 7 sonnets that her kids had written. And I still haven't read them. And I won't read them until my book comes out, because I don't want to be swayed by them. I don't want to, and certainly, worst case scenario, I don't want somebody to be like, hey, that was my line, right? It's always, I've learned that it's, and this has never happened to me, but I've learned that it can be a dangerous thing, right? If somebody feels like you took their idea or something, right, then that's a problem. So as much fun as it would be to work a fan theory like Jar Jar as Sith, into one of my books, I have tried to avoid that kind of thing, because I want people to feel like all the ideas are my own, except that I took all the ideas from the movie. So yeah, as much my own as they can possibly be, given the context.
Why don't you tell us something that happened as a result of this that you thought was either because as a fan you thought, wow, this is amazing, or just some nice story, that goes along with having done this thing, which is rather odd, but seems to have taken a life of its own.
Sure. So one of the fun things as a Star Wars fan is I've gotten to go to Comic Cons and things like that. I've been at C2E2 the last couple of years. Last year in April, I went to Star Wars Celebration, which is something that happens every couple of years. And it's basically a Comic Con just for Star Wars. And while I was there, I got to meet Mark Hamill and give him a book, which was pretty awesome. But even cooler than that was that Ian McDiarmid, who played Emperor Palpatine in the movies, he had his own panel. And while he was being interviewed, they asked him, you know, as a fan yourself, what Star Wars merchandise do you like these days? And he said, well, I like those Shakespeare Star Wars books. And so, you know, already I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he said that, you know. And then they must have known that he was going to say that. They must have asked him about it beforehand, because then they had a copy of The Jedi Doth Return right there, and they asked him, can you please read this speech from Palpatine in Palpatine's voice, you know. So he gets up and they turn the microphone on, like huge reverberation, right? And he does his Palpatine voice and talks about the Jedi. And there he is, like reading my stuff, right? This is like top 2 or 3 moments as a Star Wars fan, as an author, getting to see something like that. On the Shakespeare side, I got to do a reading and a book event at the Shakespeare's Birthplace shop in Stratford-on-Avon, which is, you know, like Mecca for Shakespeare people, and so that was really awesome. So yeah, I've been super lucky. I always tell people who want to write that, you know, writing is not supposed to go this way. You're not supposed to send an editor an idea and hear back immediately and have it work out and have your first book published within a year of having the idea. It just doesn't happen in the publishing industry. And so I've been incredibly lucky in all of this.
Okay, we have time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah. Favorite Shakespearean play? That's harder. It's way harder than favorite Star Wars movie. But I'll give you a handful. Hamlet, I love. It's probably the one I know best. Probably the one I've seen movies, film versions of the most. Much Ado About Nothing, I love. I was a sophomore in high school, summer after my sophomore year, when Kenneth Branagh came out with his Much Ado About Nothing, which I saw in the theater with my mom, hot date with mom, like 10 times at age 16. And The Tempest, I really love The Tempest. Soft spot in my heart for that. Henry V is another favorite. So, yeah, so many. I mean, Romeo and Juliet, Othello. I've always wanted to play Iago in Othello, the villain in Othello. I don't know what that says about my personality, but I have. So, yeah, there's a handful. Yes. Well, so the first book, I had the idea, let's say roughly July 20th was when I emailed the editor at Quirk Books about it, and that was 2012. And the book came out July 2nd, 2013. So that was just under a year. And book publishing, it takes time, and that's something I've learned. So I will... for the last of the prequels, Revenge of the Sith, I turned that in something like March 1st. So that one took me about 2 months to write. I started writing in very early January, finished it just at the beginning of March, handed it in. We went through the editorial process with Quirk Books, then the editorial process with Lucasfilm. They get to, you know, say yes or no to things. Then through all the other stuff, right, and reviewing the proofs, the printing proofs and all that stuff. And it came out in September of last year. So it was 6 months from me turning in the first draft to when it actually appeared on the shelves. Now, not every book, sometimes, we've all seen books that, like, you know, Steve Jobs dies and 2 weeks later there's a biography of his out, right? So there are exceptions. Thank you all so much. Thank you.